Okay, so what is the doctrine of doing and allowing? That's our next big question, picking up from where we were in the last video. Well, here's how it's articulated in Schaefer-Landau on page 235. It is always morally worse to do harm than to allow that same harm to occur. That's the doctrine. And the absolutist is committed to this doctrine. So if we have a reason to accept it, that's a reason to embrace absolutism. This doctrine does seem to explain some of our moral intuitions. For example, many would say that we are morally permitted to spend our money on a nice dinner rather than giving it to a charity that saves children's lives. Right? We're allowed to do that from a moral perspective, many would say, even though we know that this decision will effectively allow one or more of those children to die. We can foresee that result, not sending the money. We can foresee that one effect of not sending the money is that someone might die as a result of not getting the money that I could have sent them. Nevertheless, I'm morally permitted to make that choice, right? It would be good to give to the charity. Many would argue, though, that we're not obligated to do so, right? Duty does not demand that of us. And so we are permitted to refrain from acts of charity. I might be criticized on other grounds, but it's not my duty to give to acts of charity, you could argue. This is an intuition that many people have. But we are never permitted to kill an innocent child directly. So while in this case I may be permitted to do something that results in allowing a child to die, I don't do everything that I possibly could to prevent that from happening. I haven't done anything to directly cause the death of the child. I haven't killed. Although you could say I've allowed someone to die, but I haven't violated a basic moral principle. Okay, at least the absolutist wants to say that, right? In other kinds of cases, though, it seems like the difference between doing and allowing doesn't seem to make much of a moral difference at all. And so the moral absolutists claim that we should always allow some harm to occur over intentionally doing the same harm ourselves begins to look irrational, as Schaefer-Landau puts it. It's an irrational view. It's a distinction that has no basis in reason. And in some cases, you could even argue that it seems like intentionally doing the harm ourselves might be better than allowing that harm to occur. Sometimes killing is better than allowing to die. So not only does the distinction maybe not make a moral difference, but sometimes it seems to make a difference, but not in the way that the absolutist thinks. So for example, in some cases, taking direct steps toward ending someone's life might be better, morally speaking, than allowing that person to die. Okay, we can think about cases of euthanasia there. So maybe the absolutist can't defend the doctrine of doing allowing in the end. And this would give us reason to question absolutism itself, or the idea that there are moral rules that can never be broken, or actions that are never permitted. Okay. Anyway, we're left with a question at the end of chapter 15 about whether absolutism can be defended or not, right? All monists are absolutists, so it's a question of whether we can defend monism, but even some pluralists are absolutists. So it remains an open question at the end, although I think Schaefer-Landau gives us good reason to question absolutism. I'll let you puzzle that on your own, though. But look, suppose we do reject absolutism. Or suppose, after puzzling it out on your own, you decide that we should reject absolutism. Where does that leave us? Are we left with a kind of relativism? And this is the last ism of today. What is relativism? I'm not going to say as much here. I want you to think about that. That was the focus of the chapter 19 reading in Schaefer-Landau, but also the Gensler article that I had you read on cultural relativism. It's also the focus of Enoch's piece. What's his name? Sorry. The other reading for today was, what's the author's name? I always forget his name. Yes, David Enoch, right? Why I am an objectivist about ethics is a kind of response to relativism. And Harry Gensler's cultural relativism, of course, he's describing the view, but then criticizing it. And Schaefer-Landau is criticizing the view of relativism in chapter 19. But what is relativism? Okay. Well, this is the idea that there are no objective moral standards. and that moral rules lack genuine authority over us. Right? The idea that moral rules have authority over us is kind of a fiction, an illusion, or a story we tell ourselves, but it's not really true. And the worry that we have at the end of chapter 15 is that if moral rules are not absolute, then they become merely subjective and begin to lose their authority over us. Now that doesn't follow, right? We can reject absolutism, I think, without embracing subjectivism, but there's a worry about that. Okay, how do we do that? Anyway, what does it mean to say that that moral standards are not objective? That's the central claim of the relativists, that moral standards are not objective. What does that mean? Well, a standard is objective if it applies to everyone. So if there are no objective moral standards, then there are no moral rules that apply to everyone. Look, another way of thinking about it, look, a moral standard is objective if it's based on something that's true, if it's based on moral truths. So are there any moral truths, right? Are there any basic moral claims that we can agree are true in the sense that, like, the earth is not round is true, right? There are certain claims that we can prove scientifically. Are there any true moral claims? If not, then maybe there are no objective moral standards. So ethical relativism is the denial that moral standards are objective. There are two varieties of relativism that Schaefer-Landau considers. The first, he defines as subjectivism. An act is morally acceptable just because I approve of it or my commitments allow for it. That's on page 295, chapter 19. That's one form of relativism, one way of denying that moral standards are objective. They're relative to me, right? What makes something right is that I approve of it. That makes it right for me, not for you, but for me, right? Or my commitments allow for it, for me, maybe not for you. That's a form of subjectivism, right? Moral standards are relative to my opinions, my attitudes. Cultural relativism is a more complex view. An act is morally acceptable just because it's allowed by the guiding ideals of the society in which it is performed. So here moral standards are relative to a culture, to a society, not to an individual. Okay? Those are two versions of relativism. They're both committed to the claim that moral standards are subjective, they're not objective. So, do we have any reason to accept relativism in one of these two forms? What are the arguments against it, right? What are the arguments against relativism? How do we defend objectivity in ethics? That's the task for chapter 19 in Schaefer-Landau, or at least to raise questions about relativism. But certainly the Gensler essay lays out the position of cultural relativism and then sort of argues against it. So I'll let you look at those arguments yourself. Neither of them, I think, are defending absolutism. So that's sort of the question, right? Can we defend the objectivity of moral standards? That is to say, can we argue against the relativist without becoming an absolutist? Right? Is there some way of defending objectivity in ethics without defending absolutism? Or do they have to go together? Okay. I'll leave you with that question. I hope this was useful, and I will hopefully see some of you in the Google Meet classroom this week. Okay, take care. Bye. Stay well.